I'd like to call this meeting of your Newark City Council to order. Janine, please call the roll.
Mr. Rath?
Here.
Mr. Barker?
Here.
Mr. Blake?
Here.
Mr. Bub?
Here.
Mr. Fidel?
Here.
Ms. Hall?
Here.
Mr. Harris?
Here.
Mr. Labutus?
Here.
Mr. Lang?
Here.
Mr. Marmee?
Present.
We have all here or present this evening. Next, if you please rise for the invocation by Mr. Blake, followed by the pledge of allegiance.
And bow your heads. God, precious Lord, we welcome you into this space to give us your forever and unconditional love. Be with our local hero, one of our own firefighters, as he recovers from injured ribs. Be with all of our first responders as they go about their daily duties to serve the people of Newark. Be with the voters tomorrow, to the Newark citizens, as they make their voices heard in tomorrow's election. And Lord, give us all ease and calmness and peace to accept the outcome. May your will be done. Amen.
Amen.
Please join me in the pledge of allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Next on the agenda, we have caucus. That's the time for council to discuss anything pertaining to the agenda tonight. Do we have anything?
Mr. President?
Mr. Marmee.
Yes, I'd like to invoke Rule 11 for Resolution 20-86.
Mr. Marmee, is that all right with you, Mr. Blake? Okay. Janine, you want to go ahead and read 20-86?
Resolution number 20-86 by Mr. Rath and Mr. Marmee, a resolution authorizing and directing the Director of Public Service to enter into contract without competitive bidding for necessary emergency repairs at Newark Fire Station number 3 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Janine. Mr. Rhodes, did you want to say anything to this or not?
No, I think it really spoke to the committee.
Thank you. You've heard the reading of 20-86. We are using Rule 11. It is an emergency. What is your wish?
Mr. President?
Mr. Marmee.
Make a motion to adopt Resolution 20-86.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Marmee. Second by Mr. Blake. Is there any discussion on 20-86? Seeing none, Janine, please call the roll to vote.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Barker?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
20-86 passes 10-0. Next on the agenda, we have our minutes of our October 19th, 2020 meeting. Is there a motion to approve those? Motion. Motion by Mr. Labutus.
Second.
Second by Mr. Barker. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. That passes. We have no appointments this evening. We have 3 reports from standing committees, one from finance, one from service, and one from personnel. Without objection, those will be received and filed. We have no reports this evening from city officials. We have no communications. Next on the agenda, we have comments from citizens. There are 2 times for comments from citizens. One's now and one is after the legislation. This is not a question and answer with council. This is just your opportunity to be heard. Do we have anyone who would like to speak this first section? Sir, just come on up, give us your name and address for the record.
Hello, Stephen Smith, 237 Violet Court, Newark. I just want to make a comment in general. One of my neighbors, the whole family has come down with COVID-19. Several adults and 1 infant. So far they seem to be doing well. And it just infuriates me when I go out to stores and I see the cavalier attitude that people take about wearing masks or wearing masks incorrectly when people are getting harmed by their selfishness. This is a matter of public safety, public responsibility, and I hear people saying things like it's their freedom of choice to not use the mask if they don't feel like it. And I feel that by the same argument, it should be their freedom of choice to be able to drive while intoxicated, by the same logic. This is a public safety issue. We are all in this together. I just had to make my feelings known. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else for this first section? Okay, moving on. We have ordinances on the second reading, 20-31.
Ordinance number 20-31 by Mr. Bub, Mr. Marmee, Mr. Rath, an ordinance amending the position, classification, pay range, and department authorization tables of the City of Newark Department of Public Safety, Division of Police by creating the classifications of Secretary 2 and Detective Bureau Clerk/Analyst and setting the compensation therefore.
You've heard the second reading of 20-31. What is your wish?
Mr. President,
Mr. Bub?
I'll move we adopt ordinance 20-31.
Motion by Mr. Bub. Second by Mr. Labutus. Is there any discussion on 20-31? Seeing none, Janine, please call the roll vote.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Barker?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
20-31 passes 10-0. Next on the second reading, we have 20-32.
Ordinance number 20-32 by Mr. Bub, Mr. Marmee, and Mr. Rath, an ordinance amending the position classification, pay range, and department authorization tables of the City of Newark Department of Public Safety, Division of Fire and EMS by creating the classification of administrative specialist and setting the compensation therefore.
You've heard the second reading of 20-32. What is your wish?
Mr. President,
Mr. Bub.
I'll move we adopt ordinance 20-32.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Bub. Second by Mr. Labutus. Is there any discussion on 20-32? Seeing none, Janine, please call the roll vote.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Barker?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Ms. Hall? Yes. Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
20-32 passes 10-0. Next, we have 20-33.
Ordinance number 20-33 by Mr. Bub, Mr. Marmee, Mr. Rath, an ordinance amending the position classification, pay range, and department authorization tables of the City of Newark Department of Public Safety, Division of Property Maintenance by creating the classification of property maintenance inspector and setting the compensation therefore.
You've heard the second reading of 20-33. What is your wish?
Mr. President, I'll move we adopt ordinance 20-33.
Motion by Mr. Bub. Second by Mr. Labutus. Is there any discussion on 20-33?
Mr. President,
Mr. Harris.
I'm glad to see this position that will help the property maintenance department. With this position, they'll get about 1,000 more inspections a year, and that will help our city to clean up and become a better city all around. So I appreciate everybody's support for this piece here.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Anyone else?
Mr. President, yeah, and I would echo that. I hope that, again, you know, with this, you know, we have to make sure this fits within our budget too next year. So, you know, this isn't a foregone conclusion, but we are going to create that. So hopefully that we can work that out within our budget next year. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bub. Anyone else? Can you please call the roll vote?
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Barker?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Ms. Hall? Yes. Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
20-33 passes 10-0. And finally, on the second reading, we have 20-34.
Ordinance number 20-34 by Mr. Rath, Mr. Bub, and Mr. Marmee, an ordinance authorizing and directing the Newark City Safety Director to certify to the Licking County Auditor the sum of $293,233 incurred by the Newark City Property Maintenance Department with respect to property maintenance violations to be placed as a lien upon certain parcels of real property situated in the city of Newark, Ohio.
You've heard the second reading of 20-34. What is your wish?
Mr. President,
Mr. Rath.
I'd like to make a motion to adopt 20-34.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Rath.
Second.
Second by Mr. Bub. Is there any discussion on 20-34? Seeing none, Janine, please call the roll vote.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Barker?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub,
Yes.
Mr. Fennell,
Yes.
Ms. Hall,
Yes.
Mr. Harris,
Yes.
Mr. Labutus,
Yes.
Mr. Lang,
Yes.
Mr. Marmee,
Yes.
20-34 passes 10-0. Next, we go to ordinances on the first reading, 20-35.
Ordinance number 20-35 by Mr. Rath and Mr. Marmee, an ordinance changing the zoning classification of certain real property generally described as 298 Bell Vista Avenue, City of Newark, Licking County, Ohio, from that of LC Limited Commercial District to Single-Family Residence RH High Density District, zoning code of the City of Newark, Ohio.
I believe this one moving on to Planning Commission. Next, we have 20-36.
Ordinance number 20-36 by Mr. Rath and Mr. Marmee, an ordinance annexing certain territory generally described as being .29 acres, more or less, located in Newark Township to the City of Newark, Ohio.
20-36 will be held for 2 weeks for our next meeting. Next, we get our resolutions on the second reading, 20-73.
Resolution number 20-73 by Mr. Marmee, Mr. Rath, and Mr. Bub, a resolution authorizing and directing the mayor of the City of Newark to prepare and submit to the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, a one-year use of funds action plan along with an application for FY 2021 Federal Community Development Block Grant Funds, CDBG, as required by 24 CFR Part 91.220 for various programs related to housing and community development.
Heard the second reading of 20-73. What is your wish?
Mr. President,
Mr. Marmee.
I make a motion to adopt Resolution 20-73.
Motion by Mr. Marmee.
Second.
Second by Mr. Barker. Is there any discussion on 20-73? Seeing none, Janine, please call the roll to vote.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Barker?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
20-73 passes 10-0. Finally, on the second reading, we have 20-77.
Resolution number 20-77 by Mr. Rath and Mr. Marmee, a resolution authorizing the Director of Public Service to prepare and submit applications to participate in the Ohio Public Works Commission State Capital Improvements Program and to execute contracts as required.
You've heard the second reading of 20-77. What is your wish?
Mr. President,
Mr. Rath.
make a motion to adopt 20-77.
Motion by Mr. Rath.
Second.
Second by Mr. Barker. Is there any discussion on 20-77? Seeing none, Janine, please call the roll to vote.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Barker?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
20-77 passes 10-0. Now we go to resolutions on the first reading, 20-78.
Resolution number 20-78, expedite by Mr. Marmee and Mr. Rath, a resolution appropriating monies for current expenses of the municipal corporation.
20,
Mr. President,
Mr. Marmee.
I make a motion to waive the two-day reading rule on Resolution 20-78.
Motion to waive the two-day reading rule by Mr. Marmee.
Second.
Second by Mr. Barker. Mr. Marmee.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have some, an item that needs to be expedited on here. We have some money that needs to be moved in order to make sure that they can be put into the appropriate payroll. Also, we have some supplies that need to be paid for immediately, so ask for this to be expedited.
Thank you, Mr. Marmee. Janine, please call the roll to waive the two-day reading rule.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Barker?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
Two-day reading rule has been waived. Mr. Marmee.
Thank you, Mr. President. Make a motion to adopt Resolution 20-78.
Motion to adopt by Mr. Marmee.
Second.
Second by Mr. Barker. Any other discussion on 20-78 before we go? Seeing none, Janine, please call the roll to vote.
Mr. Rath?
Yes.
Mr. Barker?
Yes.
Mr. Blake?
Yes.
Mr. Bub?
Yes.
Mr. Fennell?
Yes.
Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Labutus?
Yes.
Mr. Lang?
Yes.
Mr. Marmee?
Yes.
20-78 passes 10-0. Next on the first reading, we have 20-79.
Resolution number 20-79 by Mr. Rath and Mr. Marmee, a resolution authorizing and directing the Director of Public Service for the City of Newark, Ohio to enter into a lease agreement with Park National Bank for the lease purchase of one bucket truck for use in the Division of Street and Traffic.
20-79 will be held for 2 weeks to our next meeting, November 16th. Next, we have 20-80.
Resolution number 20-80 by Mr. Rath and Mr. Marmee, a resolution authorizing and directing the Director of Public Service for the City of Newark, Ohio to enter into a lease purchase agreement with the Park National Bank for the purchase of 2 police cruisers and 1 pickup truck for the Division of Police.
20-80 will be held for 2 weeks to our next meeting. And next, we have 20-81.
Resolution number 20-81 by Mr. Marmee and Mr. Rath, a resolution appropriating monies for the current expenses of the municipal corporation.
20-81 will be held for 2 weeks to our next meeting. And finally, we have 20-82.
Resolution number 20-82 by Mr. Rath and Mr. Marmee, a resolution authorizing and directing the Director of Public Service of the City of Newark, Ohio to enter into contract without competitive bidding for the pre-purchase of ultraviolet light disinfection system equipment at the City of Newark wastewater treatment plant.
And 20-82 will be held for 2 weeks to our next meeting. I'm sorry. And that concludes the legislation this evening. Thank you. All right, Nick. Next on the agenda, we have our second opportunity for comments from citizens. Do we have anyone? Anyone from administration this evening?
Good evening, Mr. President. On behalf of the administration, I want to thank this council for its support of Ordinance 2031, 32, and 33. It's much appreciated.
Thank you. That was Bill Spurgeon. Anyone else? Judge Stansbury, you just here looking good?
You flatter me. I was here to answer any additional questions about our piece of our resolution.
Okay. Sounds good. Okay. Mayor Hall. Okay.
You want to grab our law director?
We'll go with the Honorable Law Director Sassen.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll pass.
Mayor Hall.
Thought I'd give him the
I was going to go this way.
I want to thank our police and fire, men and women of police and fire this week. You know, during this COVID, when many of us are tasked with distancing and staying home, and they have to be out working with the people. This past week has been a little bit of a tougher week. We had a pretty good burnout on Oakwood. That was a vacant home, and then followed by the commercial building fire down on Clinton. That was a long night for many of them. Police and fire. Police did traffic control. I want to thank Mutual Assistance. At one time, I think we had 25 units there and in staging, and pumped a lot of water for 2.5 to 3 hours solid, and then threw into the night a little bit as it flared up. So, and then, of all things, of course, with legislation night, somebody runs into one of our fire buildings, so Station 3. So, been a little tough. I want to appreciate men and women of police and fire, though, and all they do during these times and through this week they've had. Thank you. Without a doubt.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Rath.
Thank you. I'll call a service committee meeting for the 16th and remind everybody to vote tomorrow. And with that, I'll pass.
Thank you, Mr. Rath. Mr. Barker.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just would like to congratulate the Newark Catholic volleyball team on winning districts this past weekend, and they're headed to regionals, so congratulations to them. And also, big kudos to our police and fire. Chief and I were actually in contact Saturday, just making sure that our injured firefighter was okay, and just thankful for all they do to keep our citizens safe. And with that, I will pass.
Thank you, Mr. Barker. Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll pass.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Mr. Bubb.
Yes, Mr. President, 2 items this evening. First, I need to call a personnel committee meeting for 2 weeks, which will be November 16th. And finally, would like to thank the Newark schools for stepping in to help the Newark Catholic, who is proceeding there in the state playoffs. They were able to move, Newark High was able to move their game to an away site, along with delaying a light project where they're upgrading the lights at White's Field, so Newark Catholic could play at home this weekend in front of their fans. So I wanted to thank the schools for being a good partner with that. With that, I'll pass. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Buck. Mr. Fennell?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would also like to thank all of our first responders during this incredibly difficult time, not to mention all of the two fires and, of course, one of our firefighters being wounded as well. So I wish them a speedy recovery, and also would like to echo that it is Election Day tomorrow, so if you haven't done so already, please turn out and vote. With that, I will yield.
Thank you, Mr. Fennell. Ms. Hall?
Yes, thank you. I too wanted to remind everybody to vote tomorrow. It's our privilege. Also, excuse me, speaking of voting, just a quick statement to clarify a recent article in The Advocate. Some people are upset that temporarily there is an R after my name. In a recent primary, I voted for a Republican. It was my decision and important to me to do that. That changed my affiliation. However, in turning in my paperwork to run again in 2021, there will be a D after my name. Since my first day as a member of council in 2014, I have always voted in the best interest of the First Ward as well as all of Newark. Know that I will not be told how to vote. I will not ask permission. I will not be bribed. Thank you, and pass.
Thank you, Ms. Hall. There's also a D in front of your name. There's also a D in front of your name. D. Hall. Mr. Harris.
Yeah, I would like to say something about the last two fires we've had over the last couple of days is, and I believe there's no insurance on these properties. And so what that means is our property maintenance got to take money out of their budget to go clean these properties up. And it could hurt their budget. And I'd like to see us maybe look into something on these properties that don't have insurance. Maybe we could go after the property owner or something to try to get some money back to put back in these budgets, because if you got a big commercial fire and that, say, just guessing $70,000, $80,000 to clean up the property, that's a big chunk of change out of their budget. So I don't know, call some kind of meeting to discuss this, and I think that's important because it's not fair to the taxpayers that that pay their taxes and they pay their own insurance and then have to help clean up some other stuff. But with that, I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Mr. Levitas?
Thank you, Mr. President. So we just wanted to remind everyone to vote tomorrow. It is our greatest privilege. Obviously, early voting is finished at this point, but I feel the kudos to Lincoln County Board of Elections. My wife and I were able to vote a few weeks ago. Early, quick, fast, efficient, and safe job by them. So kudos to them on early voting. And if you haven't, vote tomorrow. That I will pass.
Thank you, Mr. Levitas. Mr. Lang?
Thank you, Mr. President. We've got a long soliloquy I wanted to deliver tonight. I know you were hoping I'd have something to say.
Mr. Marmon?
No, I really do want to thank our first responders. I know it's been a very difficult week responding to a couple different situations that are a little out of the ordinary, and glad to hear that our firefighter who injured themselves was able to at least go home from the hospital and is recovering. I heard a couple of things about voting tomorrow. I think that's something folks are supposed to do. If you weren't aware, I think you've been living in a hole. So make sure you get out and vote. And obviously, the Board of Elections has been doing a really nice job down there, and wish them luck tomorrow. It'll be a challenging day, I think, for all our poll workers. Kudos to the folks who are standing out there to help make sure we can vote tomorrow. And with that, I'll yield. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Lang. And Mr. Marmon?
Thank you, Mr. President. I need to call a Finance Committee meeting. I, too, want to congratulate both Newark Catholic volleyball and football programs for their current success and wish them good fortune moving forward. I'm going to echo what Councilman Bub indicated. Newark High School was just a great partner. The new superintendent, as soon as he found out, he goes, we got to find a way, and they got right on it. And I really appreciate the fact that they're supporting, each other, and Newark Catholic's football program is going to be able to play at home at Whitefield. Otherwise, they probably would have had to travel to like Zanesville or something out of our community, where we wouldn't have received, the folks eating dinner and things like that before and after the game. So I do appreciate that. I also want to thank our first responders. They've done a fantastic job, and I just heard that they had to run out to the Trout Club this evening for another possible fire, but luckily it was not. And they've been extremely busy and just on the spot. I do appreciate everything that they do, and I also know that during these times of COVID, they're having to do extra things just to make sure they protect themselves and protect others, and it doesn't make it easy, but they appear to make it seem that way because they just continue to do their job. I also want to finally just comment to the fact that, I know there are those out there that are not abiding by the rules, but I look and I see in our community far more people abiding by the rules and doing things positive to make sure that the spread of COVID does not continue on. And I appreciate all of those folks, and I want to focus on the positive and those folks that are doing things right. And the governor this over the weekend, and the spike that's hit, actually it's an increase in numbers, but the number of hospitalization percentage is down. The number of other things, indicators, are down a little bit. And the key thing is they're finding that most of these things are actually happening in social gatherings of family members, weddings, funerals, and just family get-togethers. And everybody's quick to blame those that are going out and whether they go to a facility that they social distance and they eat their dinner, or they do whatever they want to do as far as entertainment. That isn't where he's seeing those indications, and I really do think that folks that they want to do things, they want to stay positive, they want to stay active, and that activity, I think, also helps promote their own mental and physical health. So I want to say kudos to those folks that are exercising, that doing things the correct manner, and making sure that the spread doesn't go rampant. And with that, I pass.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Our next committee meetings will be November 16th at 5:45. Our full council meeting will be at 7 o'clock. If you're not one of those 90-some million that have already exercised your right to go out and vote, go vote tomorrow. Got a motion to adjourn? Motion by Mr. Labutus, second by Mr. Barker. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Thank you. We're adjourned.